Good afternoon. Might surprise some of you who have gone to my other talks that we're starting on time, but I assure you we'll get through this one correctly. This is Forget Duplicating Local Changes, Apache NiFi and the Flow Development Lifecycle. I believe this is the last session of the day, so I will stay up here until they kick me out. If you want to leave, I won't be offended, but if you have questions, this is all brand new stuff, so I understand it's going to be new for basically everybody in the room. I'll stay up here and answer questions as long as possible. I'll do demos as long as possible, and I'll answer more questions outside if anybody has them. So let's get started. This is an advanced talk as far as NiFi is concerned. It's new functionality. It's a complementary application. I actually, as you can see, I like to walk around on stage, but because of the demo, I'm probably going to stay just here, so forgive the static presentation. We're going to talk about what the flow development lifecycle is, the challenges we face, the introduction of Apache NiFi Registry, and the roadmap moving forward. Again, all these slides will be provided online, so you don't have to transcribe anything. You don't have to take photos. If something stands out to you, feel free, but don't feel obligated. So, flows definitely love change. I think if there's one thing we can all agree on, the flows don't stay static, right? We don't just deploy it and then leave it and let that run forever. The origins of NiFi. So NiFi was developed to provide immediate response and monitoring to data flow challenges in a very unique environment. What this often meant was that when a system broke, whether that's a storage system was unavailable, a network connection was down, something wasn't processing correctly, there was a code error, the people responsible for fixing this weren't necessarily available, either time-based, location-based, or policy-based. So it's 3 in the morning and mission critical data is falling on the floor. What are we going to do about that? Well, we'll raise a ticket, we'll try and get the developer in to fix it, or we'll get a network engineer on that, but that doesn't solve my problem in the here and now. So mitigation became really the big ticket here. And what that meant was, okay, we can't fix the underlying problem, but we can still capture that data, and we can hold on to it for some amount of time. We can maybe prioritize and drop off stuff that's not really as relevant. We can filter things, but we need to capture the stuff that's really important, and we can't let any of that fall. The analogy here is that a lot of times we consider flow to be like moving water, right? The rigidity and structure of building out large-scale plumbing systems means that you have to have the water stopped in order to build and assemble the pipes, put them together, route them around, and then you start the water all at once and it flows through the pipes, and hopefully it flows where you want it to go, but maybe there's a leak, maybe it's going the wrong direction, maybe a valve is incorrect. So to fix that, you have to go back to the source and stop the water, go back, empty the pipes, fix the pipe, go back, start it again, and see what happens. That doesn't really work in a dynamic environment where things are changing constantly, okay? So the analogy that we like to use is that water's flowing. It's a river. Consider NiFi your irrigation ditches, right? You start building these flows out. That water is going into it no matter what. But you can turn on and off specific rows or specific ditches, and then if something's working the way you want, great. If you want to add on to that, start digging from there, and water will keep flowing. Data will keep flowing into the new flow. You can have a lot of flows in parallel, right? So you're evaluating 2 competing product offerings. You're not sure whether this Hive destination or writing straight to HDFS is going to be better. Do both and see what works for you. And then when you decide what's better, you can turn one off with the click of a button. If that one no longer works, you can turn the old one on with a click of a button. So it's a very dynamic, very responsive environment for doing this. This is just a demo of that, the operator experience. So we're reading some data in from a remote system. In this case, we're just tagging it, we're geotagging it to enrich it, and then we're writing it to some destination. But when that destination fails, I need to be able to immediately have some kind of backup or some kind of rerouting. And so I can do that by just creating a connection and writing it to a local buffer, okay? This is literally those 3 clicks were how easy it was for the operators to do this. And they weren't necessarily developers or engineers. They weren't familiar with code behind it. But the user interface and user experience makes that available to people who have domain expertise but don't necessarily have the coding expertise to write a connector on the fly to fix this problem. Components provide history. So as you change the component, in this case, it's an encrypt content processor, and I've put in a raw key to encrypt some data. I can go back and I can mouse over that little help icon and see the history of this field. So if I change the value multiple times, I'll see multiple values there. I get the user who made that change. I get the timestamp that the change was enacted. In this case, I don't see the previous value because it's a sensitive value. Sensitive values are always encrypted at rest. They're never transmitted over the API, even to an existing authenticated NiFi instance. Once it's in the flow, it's encrypted, it's used on the server, but it never goes across the wire back to the user interface or the API. And then to export a flow, I can take the flow that I have on my canvas, I would turn it into a template, I would store that template somewhere on a system, it's XML code, or I could copy the entire flow XML GZ, which is basically the central brain of the entire system. That's all of your flows, all the templates, everything that is on your NiFi canvas gets serialized to a flow XML file that's gzip compressed, and that runs, that is stored on your NiFi server. So, flow developers lose consciousness. How many people are using NiFi in a production or at least a strong test environment right now? Okay. Does anybody like updating their flows? Yeah. So again, we're coming from that mindset of these things are changing constantly in production. Like if something happens in the world, I need to change my flow. When NiFi came out into the rest of the world, guess who didn't like that? Everybody. Banks, telecommunication, healthcare, automotive. They seem to have all these rules about how we don't change things in production. So they have a NiFi developer, and then in a different building, they have a data center and DevOps and people who are actually responsible for putting that into production and connecting it to real systems. So they say, okay, developer, you go sit over there and write a flow. We'll give you a few hundred lines of test data that you can test it with. And then you have to send it to our test department. And the test department's responsible for saying, okay, we're going to take some production data, anonymize it, sanitize it, and then we're going to use that at a higher scale to run through and check flow performance and monitor all the data usage and that kind of stuff. And then when that gets signed off, then we'll send it over to production, and they'll have an overnight, 1 hour rolling cutout, backup, deploy the new flow, and now it's in production. So that could be a week or a month process as opposed to a couple minutes to change the flow when it's actually running in the environment that you want to run it in. So our solution for how do you change flows, which was just do it, didn't translate to the rest of the world. With templates, we say, okay, well, that's fine. Export your template as XML, send it to the test department, send it to the production department. They can import it. That doesn't scale. For one thing, and I think I have a slide demonstrating this later, but when you import a new template, you can't just select all the components you want to replace and say, use the new template, right? First, you're going to have, well, are you sure it's the right template? Is it flow XML gz2.backup.2765? How are you going to know? So you don't have any traceable history and auditing on that flow XML or the template.xml file. And as NiFi people, we're big on auditing and traceability, so that didn't really speak to that story. Secondly, the sensitive properties don't get exported in templates. And that's by design, but that means that if you have some flow segment and you export it as a template and import it somewhere else, you're going to need to re-enter all of the sensitive properties. With the flow XML GZs, all the sensitive properties are contained there, but they're encrypted. And if you move it to a new server that has a different key, as hopefully your dev and test and production environments do, it's not going to be able to decrypt any of those values. And finally, with the environment promotions, there's a formal approval process in most organizations. There's verifiability needs. So templates and flow XML GZ migration weren't really solving these problems. Yeah, here's an example. This is just my local machine and some of the flows that I tend to back up as I'm doing development for various things. How confident are you that you picked the right file out of that directory to go deploy to production and start modifying your industrial control system or your oil rig or your automotive robot? This on the left is actually the process of, if I'm going to import a new version of the template, what do I have to do? And it involves importing it side by side, stopping the processors, making sure that you drain data out of the queue, and then reconnect, start it up, knock on wood, hopefully it works. So here you can see side by side I have an original flow, and I've imported the template that I exported. And immediately, this is literally the first second after I import the template, you can see these warning icons because those processors have sensitive properties, and the properties are empty because it was imported, it's not contained in the template. So what kind of user experience is that? I'm importing a template, and it's already telling me it's broken. This is literally what the person just gave me before. Why am I using this tool? So finally, the lessons we've learned from Dataflow are going to help us succeed. Apache NiFi Registry 010, so note it's not 100, this is a very, very early version, was just released in January. And NiFi 1.6.0, which was released in early April, takes advantage of this, provides incredible user interface integration. That's what we're all waiting to see on screen. I understand, we're going to get there in a second, but I just want to talk about registry as a first-class citizen here. It's a complementary application. It stands alone. And that might seem like an odd decision to some people because this is NiFi Flow registry, Flow versioning. Why don't we just do that inside NiFi? The reason is that, one, you don't want to restart your registry every time you deploy a new NAR or upgrade NiFi, right? They should be independent. They should be loosely coupled. Two, and we'll get into this a little bit later, registry isn't one-to-one with NiFi. You can have multiple registries that are affiliated with a NiFi instance. You can have multiple NiFi instances affiliated with a registry. This is really important when we get into environment promotion. But it's also important because let's say you have an organization and you start building, you have one team that's doing some really cool research and design. You have another team that is really expert on the proprietary protocol that you use within your organization. You can have those teams start building out common functionality in these flows and then publishing them to a repository that other users can download into their application. So, here we go. I will go through a couple slides just to show from scratch, and then I'll get into the actual live instances that are running, and you guys can say, how do you do this, or what does this look like, and we'll try and figure it out. So to start the registry, it's an application just like NiFi. Download it, run maven clean install, change to the directory, and run the start script. And it comes up at 18.080. Bucket is kind of an odd term for some kind of data container, but every other term was already taken, and it has meanings for everybody else in the room, and they're not the same between any two people. So a bucket is just some container for an asset, and in this case, we're using it to contain flows. So we're going to create a bucket. I called it DWS Berlin Demo. I'm very original. And then I'm going to connect it to NiFi. So I have a NiFi instance running. I'm going to go up to the global menu and go to the controller settings that run the entire NiFi instance. And you can see it's kind of shaded out. But up at the top, I have registry clients. That's a new tab. I'm going to click there. I'm going to add a registry client. I put the URL in. I give it a name. And now I have that registered to my application. The way that flow versioning works is really dependent on process groups. So process group is just a logical container of processors. And in this case, I'm going to take the flows that I've already designed, and I'm going to convert them into process groups. That's a one-click operation. Select all the components you want, right-click, say group, just like you would in PowerPoint or Keynote. And now it's converted into a group. And for those of you familiar with NiFi, you know these icons up here, these icons are new. Okay? And that's showing you the state of that process group, whether it's been committed, whether it's part of the version control, whether there's a new version available, how many components within it have changed, how many components have been committed, etc. Did the same thing on the right, and now I have two process groups. So the one on the right, that red one, was imported from a template. That means that all the changes I make to the original flow have no bearing on that. It's completely decoupled, and it goes, I know nothing of where I came from, much like all of us. When you right-click on the original flow process group, there's a version menu item, and the only option in there is Start Version Control. So if I do that, it's going to prompt me with a dialog and say, Save Flow Version. And I say, yes, that's what I'd like to do. I get to pick which registry I want to save it to. So if I'm a developer, I might have a development team registry where I can share all of my flow segments with other people on my team. But I might also have a like submit for testing flow registry where I can submit that flow. The testing people will see that and say, okay, well now we'll test it. And if they succeed, they might submit it to production and say, hey, this is now available for your production to deploy. I have a flow name, that's pretty easy. A flow description. You see the 1 in the circle next to that, that's the first version of this flow. And then I can add version comments. So the flow description, you can modify that, but it stays consistent between versions of a flow. Whereas the version comments, I'm saying, hey, in this case, it's my first version of the flow. If I change something later, I might add some comments so people can quickly browse the versions and see, oh, this is the one that I need. So now you see a green check mark to the left of the original flow title on that process group. And that means that it is checked into version control, and it is up to date. Nothing dirty in there. It's good. If I switch over to my registry view, I can see this. I took the screenshot a little bit later, but you can see that that flow exists inside the bucket. It has unique identifiers for the bucket itself and for the flow, but then it has that description I entered. It shows version 1, and then 5 minutes later, I committed version 2. And what I had done was added an update attribute processor to, I'll get into the flow itself, but to mark some flow files with a specific attribute. Now I want to bring a new instance of that flow back into my NiFi. And again, I'm doing it on the same instance, but you could be doing this in test. This would be exactly how you would bring a flow into your test environment. I go up and I drag a process group icon onto the canvas, just like I would if I was going to add a brand new process group. And instead of giving it a title, I'm going to say import. And see that little cloud download icon right below that. So once I do that, I have the option of selecting which registry I want to communicate with, which bucket within that registry I want to pull from, and which flow in the bucket I'd like to get. Once I've selected those 3 things, I'm given the list of versions of that flow. So here, I could import version 1, which is the very first version of the flow, or I could import version 2, which is the one that has the changes I made. And once I do that, I now have a new process group, has the same title, has the exact same contents, has a green check mark, because it's up to date with the version control in the registry. But if you notice, in my actual original flow, I have 7 stopped components, 0 with warnings. On this one, I have 5 stopped components and 2 with warnings. And that's the same issue we encountered earlier, where those encrypt and decrypt processors don't have the sensitive value persisted. This is the flow itself. So you can see I'm generating some arbitrary text. I'm encrypting it. I'm marking it as encrypted with an update attribute processor, logging it just to demonstrate the code, decrypting it with the same key, marking it as plain text again, and then logging it again. The encrypt content and decrypt content processors, this is the original one, but in the new flow would have that warning icon because the sensitive property needs to be populated. It won't work for sensitive properties because that's by design. But for any other property, and we'll get into it, you can populate that with a variable and then have different environments with different variable registries that already exist in NiFi and pull from that automatically. So as the flow designer, I would say, okay, well, this database URL is going to be different for development, test, and production. So I'm going to set a variable called database URL and say, hey, all these database processors rely on that variable to populate this property. And when you deploy it into the test environment and you already have all those variables defined in your variable registry, all of them get populated automatically. That also persists when you bring in new versions of the flow. So as long as that variable property hasn't changed, you can bring in a new version of the flow. It'll overwrite that existing processor. You won't have to go back and re-enter that property. It recognizes it. Here we're going to modify the original flow. And I'm going to change it. I was using AES Galois counter mode to do encryption. I'm going to change this to AES counter mode just to demonstrate some difference in the flow. I changed that, and now you can see up in the original flow, I have a star there. I have an asterisk because it's been modified locally. So it's saying, I am under version control, but you have local changes that are not committed to your registry. I want to see the local changes. In this case, I'm actually looking at a newer version where I've made changes here on the copied or imported flow, and I push these back up to the repository, to the registry. And now here, that exclamation point icon is telling me you have a new version of this flow available, but you have local changes that conflict with it. So what can I do? Well, here I'm reverting the local changes because I just want to pull down the new one. But I can also show the local changes so I see what I'm going to get rid of. And it's warning me, hey, before you revert, you made a change where you added a property to the mark as encrypted processor and you added the property group. If I hit that arrow, it will take me into the process group, directly to the processor that changed. I can manually revert that. I can, maybe if I had a value in that property, I can write it down so that when I pull from the new one, I can go put that back in. But I say, no, I'm going to revert. I'm going to commit these new changes. And now when I'm going to save a new version of the flow, you can see that it's telling me exactly it's the third version of this flow going to this bucket in this registry. Do I want to add any version comments? Yep, I want to say that I changed the cipher to AES-CTR, added the group as an attribute, and added a local variable for that group. So when I commit, again, I go back to the registry. This is updating automatically, and I can see that now I have the third version. And I can go back and look at any one of the versions and see the version comments, and I can also browse that from inside NiFi. If I want to pull down a new version, so remember, I made some changes in this quote-unquote original that's actually a copy, and I push this up. There's a back reference. So it's not like a template at all, where I pull the template in, I make a change. Everybody who was using that template doesn't know about it. There's no way for them to get it until I export that template again, and they overwrite it manually. With these flow versioning tools, I make a change here, and I commit it. The original knows that there's a change available, and that's a red up arrow icon telling me that I have a new upstream version that I can download if I want. I go into version menu, I say change version. I get this dialog that is listing all of the versions that are available. So when I was doing the demo, I actually changed one, put it up, forgot to change something else, so I had another revision. And if I say OK, it tells me, great, process group version has been changed, and I'm back to, I didn't have a screenshot. It's back to a green check mark. It's completely synchronized with the available version in the repository. So we've got 17 minutes until the talk is actually over. Again, I'll stay up here as long as I can. Do you want a demo or do you want questions? Demo, okay. So this is the NiFi registry. And actually, I'm going to try and make the font a little bit bigger for people to see. If you're in the back, I apologize, but hopefully this is visible to enough of the audience. Okay, cool. So I have this simple encrypt and decrypt flow for DWS. That's what I made today. It's in my DWS Berlin demo bucket. There are 4 versions of it. I can expand this. I can go back and look at all of the different versions. Now here you see by anonymous. For this simple demo, I didn't secure either instance, and I didn't set up user access control. But you can do that. The same model that NiFi uses to do user access control applies to NiFi Registry. So you can import users and groups from your LDAP. You can use client certificate authentication. You can use Kerberos. And then once you have users, you can have groups. You can say, OK, HR can affect the HR bucket, but they shouldn't be able to get into the security and incident reporting bucket. Accounting or automotive research can handle their buckets. There might even be a shared bucket. There might be common flow segments, something like read from a file, split, use JSON, use XML parsing, use a record reader writer, and convert this standard format that we have throughout our company into something that a specific tool needs. Somebody can develop that flow and publish it to a shared bucket, and then every other developer can have access to that so they don't have to reinvent the wheel. And when that developer who's responsible for it makes a change and says, oh, I've improved something, or I fixed a bug, or there was a new version that was published and now I have to update our flow, they can fix that. They can commit it to the repository. That NiFi registry will say, hey, there's a new version available. Anybody who is using it can now download it and make sure they have the latest and greatest. The only action right now is delete because I don't have user access control set up, but you'd be able to change permissions and things like that as well. So here's my NiFi canvas. In this demo, I was really just, I had an original flow and then a copied flow, and I was, as I said, generating some data, encrypting it, marking it as encrypted, and then logging it, and then reversing that, decrypting it, marking it as decrypted, and logging it again. So I can show you, and then when you do the variable registry stuff, if you set up a variable, you publish that variable with the flow. So when you version a flow, that variable registry that's set up on the specific process group that's being versioned comes with it. So what I did was I set up this copycat group, and it's in blue, right? And if I look at the variables here, I have a variable named group, and I have a value copycat group. That was the first one that I made. So when I committed this to the repository, to the registry, the original flow in green here, the variables, it got a new variable called group, and the default value was copycat group. But obviously this is the original. I want to change that. So I can change this to original group, hit apply. Both of these have output ports at the bottom, sending it back to root. So I can go back to the root process group, and I've added a connection from each of those to a log attribute processor. And if I list the queue here, I should see some from both process groups, and I can look at the attributes and see, okay, this was from the original group. And I can look at others. Let's just guess around. This was from the copycat group. Oh, that was good clicking. So you can see that that group attribute has been updated from the specific process group instance on the canvas, right? If I make some changes to the flow and commit it to the registry and then update it on the other one, it won't overwrite that value. That value's been changed locally. I don't have to worry about bringing in the default again, okay? So this is really useful if you have multiple groups. A lot of times during the conference, I've heard questions where we're ingesting data from a bunch of different sources, but the process is very similar, right? How can we reuse something, or do we have to do the same 5 processors a million times? You can do these flow segments where you're performing the common functionality. And if you think of it like programming, right, you're using some library or you're using a function that takes in parameters that are going to be different every time, but the common behavior is the same. So you're reusing these components, put a different attribute on it. When the flow file comes in, it gets processed, it goes through the system, and then it comes out of the output port, and you have a route on attribute, and you send it back to, okay, this came from source A, I got to send it over to destination 5. But all that processing, the translating from JSON to CSV or vice versa, or Avro, or geo-enriching or sanitizing this column, that's not dependent on the source or the destination. That's common functionality I have to do all the time. I don't need to replicate all that behavior with n many processors. I can reuse the same processor group to perform that function and then just route it based on the attributes at the end. If anybody saw Abdelkrim and Camilia's presentation yesterday about using NiFi in production at Renault, that was a big thing. Minimize the number of input and output ports that you have going from the root process group, cut down on network cost and thread cost for listening there, and have a main input port and then route based on some signal or some attribute and do it that way. And it really is beneficial on cost. So we got 11 minutes. Questions? Yes? So the question was, is it possible to see a diff between 2 different versions in the registry? I have a slide for that. It's not going to be one you like. No, as of right now, it's not possible to do that. Now, these are serialized to XML, so you can use a text diff tool to do that. It's not the best experience because you still have to understand what's being serialized there. But you could perform that diff operation. Obviously, there should be a better experience, and so I'm not going to commit to 0.2.0, but in a future version of NiFi Registry, absolutely. Version diffing, previewing incoming changes. So I showed you I can see the local changes I have before I commit or before I revert, but there's also an open JIRA for, okay, there's a new version available on the registry. Let me see what it does before I just accept it into my flow. There's also an open Jira with a PR attached actually for a Git-backed persistence provider. So integrate this with your Git system and be able to track changes through there. And then there's also an open Jira with a PR for commit hooks. So similar to if you have a Git commit hook that says trigger some review process or email some administrator or proceed along this review path, the same thing for NiFi Registry. So if a developer commits a new version of their flow, it could send an email to the testing team and say, hey, there's a new version of this available. Or it could trigger some other kind of invocation or an API call, et cetera, et cetera. But that's a great fourth bullet there, is I would encourage you to open a Jira for that. I mean, I know it's in the minds of the developers on the roadmap, but this is a community project, right? Apache NiFi, NiFi Registry, MiNiFi, MiNiFi C2 server, they're all open source. We encourage the community, we rely on the community. All of us together are smarter than any one of us by ourselves, right? Just because I'm up here doesn't mean that I know more than you or I have a better idea than you. So I encourage everybody in here to contribute, to provide ideas, requests, ask questions. The dev and users mailing lists are very welcoming places. The Stack Overflow and Hortonworks Community Connection all provide opportunities to have these conversations and share these ideas and ask for development. The other thing I would say is, because this is such an early project, you will probably have better luck with, hey, I have this idea or I have this request, than if it's like version 7.5 and you're like, hey, what if we do it this way that's completely different from how it's been done for 10 years, right? You'll have a lot more impact now by asking questions and providing ideas and hopefully shaping the path of the project moving forward. So thank you. Yes? The question is, if I have 10 flows in production, they're all executed within the main flow. And I'm going to ask you to clarify. What do you mean by main flow? Do you have 10 separate, like, chains? Okay. Okay, so it's, yeah, I'm going to pull up a diagram just so that we can point at things, right? So here I have 4 different process groups and 1 processor, right? I can start this imported flow and it doesn't affect any of the others. I can start the original flow, it doesn't affect any of the others. The same thing happens when I import a new flow from the registry. It's not attached to anything automatically. Now I can also, it's going to take a little while to drag it out, but I could start dragging connections between these process groups. These are all versioned independently of each other. I mean, well, these two happen to be the same, but this and this are versioned independently of each other. So if I drag a connection, I can update just that middle process group without affecting the previous or follow-on process groups as well. So one main flow doesn't really exist unless you look at your canvas and you only have one directed acyclic graph, okay? Everything that's on the canvas exists within the same flow.xml.gz file, but you can have as many separate, disparate flows as you want, and they all operate independently of each other. Yes. I saw way more, okay, yes. Yes, so the question was, can we populate those variables in the flow that's saved, even if we're going from something like in cloud to on-prem or vice versa? Yeah, it's completely independent of where it's executing. So if you commit a version of a flow to a registry, if they have separate registries, how are you getting the flow into the other developer environment to begin with? So you're saying, can you go from separate registries that don't have a shared NiFi instance? Yes. So that's a great question. You can go between different registries. The way you do that is using the NiFi registry command line interface. There's a command line tool which allows you to export. So registry provides you that nice user interface for administration and management and visibility, but you can integrate with the API using any API client that you want, but there's a command line interface that exists already and is published, and that allows you to say, like, all right, export all the flows in this bucket to serialized files on disk, and then import these flows from disk into a separate registry. So, and with the Git-backed persistence provider, that'll be even easier, right? You could have two registries both integrated with a single Git repository, and then push and pull as you would with any other file. But right now, you can use the command line interface to do that. Yeah, so you can go from a registry to a different registry without going through a NiFi interface between the two. I saw a question over, yes?
What happens to flow files inside a process group when you update that process group?
So that's a great question. What happens to flow files that are in the process group when you update? Because I made such a big deal earlier about when you have a template, you have to stop all the processors, you have to empty the data queues. As long as there's no destructive change to the queue, the data will stay there, and it will flow through the new version of that. If the processor that follows on was updated, it'll flow through the new version. So you have a little bit of a timing concern there, but NiFi does its best to handle that, and it says, okay, as of this timestamp when I made the change, start processing the data through the new one. The only time you'll have an issue is if the new version of that process group did a destructive change. Yeah, it deleted that queue or it routed it somewhere else. Excuse me. And then it'll give you a dialog saying, okay, we can't automatically reconcile this. You need to make a human decision of what do you want to happen with this data. We try not to secretly or silently delete any data that you have in the system. There was one in the back here. Maybe it was the same question. Yes? Yes. Yes. So the question is, can you nest versions? Can you nest process groups with inside other process groups and version the whole thing? Yes. You can also have variable registries, which, if you're familiar with variable registries, they're inherited. So if you have a variable registry at the root, every process group under it has access to those variables. But if you declare a variable inside a registry that's only inside one process group, the siblings and parents do not have access to that. The same thing applies here. So you could have, let's do it. I'm going to make a new process group, and I'm going to say this is parent. And then inside parent, I'm going to have child A, child B. I'm going to make a variable here and call it parent scope variable. And I'm the parent. I'm going to go inside child A, and so I can see that parent variable here, but I'm also going to make an A scope variable. I'm PGA. So I save that. I go back up to the parent. I go inside B, and I look at the variables. I have access to parent, but I do not have access to the A scope, right? So the same way that you can nest the process groups, you can version just one child process group. You could version the parent, which would contain both. And then if somebody else had versioned A, you could actually download a new version of the parent, and it would show you, okay, you got the most recent version of parent, but actually somebody made an even additional change to A. So you can upgrade just like that component with inside the nested process group as well. Is that a little tricky? It's easier once you start playing around with it and see it on the screen. But yeah, the hierarchical import and versioning does exist. Yes. 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 The question is, can I create policies for users to change or create, change, or delete variables? Yes, you can. I can't show you in a demo right now because I don't have this one secured, which would provide the user access control. But yes, if you look at the NiFi admin guide, there's a section called multi-tenant authorization, and then there's a subsection about user access control, and variable registry is one of the things that you can control. I believe the policy is called, there's a read and a write on variable registry, I believe. And you can do that per process group as well, so you can really drill down and make that very secure. Yes? Yes. The question is, are there different, essentially different policies you can provide to the users on the registry? Yes. The granularity of rollback but not delete, I don't think that is quite, I don't think it's quite at that granular of a level. Right now, it's essentially a read and a read-write access for the various buckets and then the various flows within those buckets. So you could say, essentially, our thinking is, if you have permission to modify bytes, you have permission to modify bytes. So there is a logical difference, but there's no permission difference between delete and modify in that case. Yeah. Yes. Okay, so the question is, what happens with controller services and connection pools? Are they covered as well? Yes, controller services, which connection pools are just a type of controller service. Yes, those are covered. Currently, reporting tasks are not, because they are only at the global level. You don't have reporting tasks inside of a process group. So reporting tasks are not covered right now, but that will be in an upcoming version. Yep. People are sticking around, but they don't have questions. This is odd. Yes. Yeah. So the question is there a command line version, or do you have to use the browser? No, you can absolutely perform all of these activities using the command line, and it's provided as part of the NiFi Registry bundle. There's a command line tool inside /bin, and that consumes the NiFi Registry API, which is exactly how the user interface does it. So anything you can do with the user interface, you can do with the command line tool. Absolutely. Yep. Yes. So the question is, did you implement Git in NiFi? No. The question is, can you branch flow versions, develop them in parallel, and potentially merge those branches together? That's definitely on the roadmap. Currently, you could take a shared ancestor, basically. So if I did like version 2 of this, and then you logged in and you said, I want to change it to be pink, and I want to change it to be orange, we'll have 2 different versions. And you can continue to develop those in isolation and keep your version backing it, but you can't merge them back together at this point. And you can't inherit other changes from the other branch. But that's on the roadmap. Like, we don't want to recreate Git in NiFi, but there are a lot of good features in Git that is kind of how everybody as a society understands version control. Well, at least McCullough and Torvalds do. So we're moving in that general direction, but it's not going to be a one-for-one recreation of all the features that are there. Yeah. Yes, it's wide open. That's what's going on. So this was 0.10, which I was showing you. As far as I think I went over the future enhancements. I can actually pull up. So here we go. Here's the open issues. There's let's see. Open issues on NiFi Registry gives 42 open issues. Trust me, there are more than 42 things to do here. So there's plenty of room for people to contribute ideas and requests. I can also pull up the wiki, and I believe there's feature proposals. Yeah, so feature proposals for the variable registry and then for the individual registry. And there's also documentation on the NiFi registry. I should have said that earlier because people have left. But on the NiFi.apache.org website, there's a registry page. It's under the sub-projects on the far right. There's plenty of information here, but what's really great, there are 3 videos called Getting Started with Apache NiFi Registry, setting up a secure Apache NiFi registry, and then setting up a secure NiFi to integrate with a secure NiFi registry. A guy named Drew Lim has done these videos. They're incredible. They start from absolute zero knowledge of the system, so you don't need to already have read a book on something. You go through, literally step by step what you have to do. This also works with Apache NiFi toolkit. So your TLS toolkit and your encrypt config toolkit will work with this. So you can, out of the box, encrypt your configurations for NiFi Registry, and you can also generate certificates for the server that are cross-signed by the same CA that you're using for NiFi. The trust store is automatically configured. The password's populated into your NiFi Registry properties. Like, you're good to go. It makes it very easy to get set up and secured right away. I might have been wrong. This is not the last session of the day. Thank you very much for attending. I will be outside if you have other questions.